In every single deal, something will pop up and it's up to you. Don't leave it in the attorney's hands. Don't leave it in the buyer or seller's hands. Make it up to you to make sure that the deal happens. And that's the difference between an okay broker to a good broker.
The listing side is easy. That's just a small part of the deal. Getting something closed. I don't want to be reliant on lawyers to do negotiating. If I'm not in the middle of something, I can't fix it when there's the inevitable hiccup that comes up. Every deal will have one. But if you're there in the middle of it, you can fix it.
Yeah, like for an example, just to jump in, we're doing a deal now, supposed to close last week. Big deal, $5 billion deal. Landlord's attorney, landlord, very difficult, extremely difficult. We did an extension of the lease. It's a 50-year lease now, another 22 years. The landlord's attorney is acting up and is trying to be a hero. She's running her bill up. I think it's on purpose. If I wasn't really involved, it could have went really bad because the buyers are like they're really pissed off because they just want to get in there and close, and the landlord is lives in a different state across the country. The deal was perfect until this. Now it's like I have to call the landlord in a different part of the world. I got to call the attorney, but we're getting it done, but it's just there's something that pops up in every deal. It's just one deal. In every single deal, something will pop up and it's up to you. Don't leave it in the attorney's hands. Don't leave it in the buyer or seller's hands. Make it up to you to make sure that the deal happens. And that's the difference between an okay broker to a good broker, in my opinion.
Mike, I think now could be a good time. I mean, I'm curious what's going on anyway. What are some of the issues that are popping up specifically, and how, as a broker, are you like putting out the fires? Because
So
we're all gonna probably run into the same
yeah.
exact
So
problem.
every specific deal is different, but for this particular deal, there was a lease in place already. And what the landlord's trying to do now, because he realizes that his increases are under market. So every year the lease increases by 1%. It's actually 5% over 5 years. So it's a little less than 1%. So he wants to change that from the lease that's existing to make it 10% over 5 years. And you can't change a lease. It's just not, I've been doing this for a while. I've done over 200 deals. I've never seen a lease change. So that's the argument. And he wants to add in personal guarantees for 50 years, which is just completely unheard of. Me dominating the car wash acquisition world, I'm calling the landlord from a different country, basically. And I'm saying, Mr. Landlord, I've done 40 car washes in your area, and this is a PG on 50 years. It's just not even the car wash world, any business that's unrealistic. It should be a good guy. So then he agreed, okay, let's do a good guy. But then the issue was he never told his attorney. So his attorney was on vacation. She just got back. She sent over the lease assignment yesterday, and it still had the PG in there. And the attorney's like a 90-year-old woman, and I call her and it's a fight right on the just hi, how are you? It's a fight. So I'm dealing with a lot of different personalities, but you never get emotional. You have to stay calm. You have to state facts. So Christian, I stated facts to him. I told him done a lot of these deals can change the existing lease. In the lease assignment, you can change it, and they're okay with that. But the existing lease has to stay the same. And then I
I actually didn't know
calculate.
that.
Sorry.
I actually didn't know that you can't change an existing lease. So I'm
I
learning that
mean,
too.
you technically could, but it's going to turn off a buyer. I've never seen that before. It's going to
It's
completely
not
turn off.
standard.
Not standard. The 1% difference out of that original lease, not including the extension, is 270,000. So that's $270,000 that the buyer is going to have to incur, and they already underwritten the deal, and we're probably going to have to negotiate a little more. So the deal's going to get done, but it's just a matter of time. And like Brian said, always something pops up.
So on that 270 throughout the term of the lease, you're saying that we might have to negotiate on the price?
I hope not, but possibly. I'm not telling them, I'm not advertising them to negotiate, but it might come up. If I was the buyer, I would negotiate. Technically, I am part of the group, but I'd rather just get this deal done.
Hey, Christian, a couple of other examples. You have lots of different issues. So some of them are playing a bit psychologist as well. But one that is honestly pretty typical that's going to come up when you get a listing. You get the listing in January. You're really dealing numbers that are a couple of months old, may potentially at that point. Let's say you get into March, you're dealing with the end of the year numbers. So they're a couple months old at that point. By the time that deal closes, it's probably going to be 9 months from that point. So you're probably talking almost 12 months from the original numbers you're using potentially. And numbers change, and you're projecting that EBITDA of 400,000 on there. And when that deal is in the home stretch, in the last, when they're doing the deep dive of current due diligence of current numbers, the EBITDA may come in at 380, it may come in at 360, it may come in at 440. I mean, it's probably not going to come in at 400. It's going to probably come in at a number that's different than that. But by having the relationship with everybody, you can work out what levers to pull and how you want to change structure a smidge to accommodate for a shortfall in EBITDA or an increase. You know, maybe the earnout gets increased, but to try to not really retrade the deal, but try to tweak structure. And if you're involved every step of the way, you see those numbers coming in, and you'll have a suggested answer to whatever that issue is. And that happens all the time on deals. I mean, just on a calendar, and on any business, the numbers 9 months later are not what the numbers were 9 months prior.
So just getting financials and numbers throughout the transaction.
You also know that realistically on any larger deal, the EBITDA is going to vary a bit just because of business cycle on there. And you got to, depending on the attitude of the buyer, that could be a significant issue on that last portion of the deal.
So another example on deals, inventory, right? Everyone should know this. Inventory is always, unless it's negotiated before, inventory is always dollar for dollar, wholesale, not including the sale of the business. So for an example, a car wash with an oil lube, right? There's a lot of inventory in oil, so you have to educate the buyers before the deal that, you're going to need another X amount of dollars for inventory. That's something that might come up if you don't bring it up right away. So that's another point.
And on inventory, there's a couple different aspects on it. I mean, when I'm on the buy side, on every deal I've done on the buy side, we always say, buy the company plus inventory. But I give a definition of inventory of good inventory only. So any inventory that's sellable within 12 months counts as good inventory. Any inventory that is not sellable within 12 months doesn't fit in there, because you as a buyer don't want to be taking over the dead stuff that is just sitting on the books that's never going to sell. And if you do end up taking that over, you want to take that over for no cash out of pocket and pay some sort of basically contingency sale, like almost a consignment sale, if that sells down the road. But the inventory aspects is another thing that changes a bit down the road, because you're not going to dig into what is good and bad inventory until you're towards the end of a deal, just realistically. So that's something that could come up, as an issue as well. Another issue that comes up in a lot of deals, pretty much all good sized deals, is working capital. The buyer's buying the business, so he could run it the same way starting tomorrow. To run that business costs, it takes capital to run that business, X amount of working capital. So in the buyer's valuation, he thinks he's entitled to purchase. He's paying off the multiple. To get that multiple, there needs to be some capital in the company. That capital needs to be there on purchase. So let's say, $150,000 in working capital. Now the seller looks at that as, wait, that $150,000 is coming directly out of my pocket. I'm selling the business, potentially debt-free, cash-free, that the working capital is not there. That's an issue that comes up on almost every decent sized deal, is the working capital aspects of it.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
Two things. The inventory piece with the old inventory, the stuff that's not going to sell. I mean, how do you structure that? Like, how do you find a common medium area where the buyer's okay with it and the seller's okay with it? Because obviously the seller, they want $1 million for everything, right? But the buyer's like, hey, that inventory hasn't sold. So how do you find a common area between the two parties? Do you just tell the seller, hey, I've done 1 million deals, this inventory is not selling? It's not really fair that they buy that. Because I've had a marble and stone company that had like $1 million in inventory, and he didn't even have like a system to really track his inventory. And yeah, a lot of it was like old stuff. So like, what would be like the suggestion to the seller and the buyer in that case?
So the best way to do this is there's companies out there. You bring them in. They're very cheap. I mean, I did a supermarket deal. $300,000 worth of inventory, took all day, but it was a $1,500 fee. And I paid the fee as the broker, because I'm like, you know what? I don't want these people fighting. Let me take care of the fee. It shows good faith, $1,500. And they counted the inventory. They said what was good, what was bad. And buyers and sellers, they want to listen to professionals. So if you bring in a third-party company, I can leave everyone contacts with inventory counters. That's the best way to do it, in my opinion.
I have a second question to Brian's point. With the working capital, so I spoke with a company on Friday, and a guy, he does about 106 million in revenue, and he has about 8 million just sitting in the business, just of his own capital. So how would you factor that into the valuation?
The 8 million, that may not be what is needed for working capital in that business. Just because he has it there, you'd have to figure out what the true working capital needs of the business are.
Right.
On $100 million entity, could there be a few $1,000,000 in working capital? Yeah, absolutely.
So Brian has an example. Brian, could you go over, how you negotiated?
Well, a few of them now with working capital where, again, the seller wants the cash in his pocket. He thinks he's entitled to it. The buyer wants the cash in the company. In his valuation, that cash is part of the overall business that's needed to run the company. He can't run the company without it. So that's the valuation that he's doing there. What we're doing on a couple of deals, it's relatively unusual. Normally, the battle on working capital is left in there and it's lost. How we have structured on one deal, and honestly, this deal has lots of other issues, but for the working capital aspect of it, the seller believes they're doing $4 million in revenue this year. They believe that they'll easily do $8 million in revenue next year, just as a given. Obviously, you'd say every seller thinks it's hockey stick growth and they'll blah, 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 that they'll hit these enormous numbers next year. And it's always next year. What we've done, and I'm going to round off on the numbers, we're keeping $150,000 in working capital in there, but we're getting, in essence, an earnout that pays back the working capital, that pays her back half of it on achieving $6.5 million in revenue, and half of it at $650 in revenue, a quarter at 7, and a quarter at 7.5 in revenue. And we've actually allocated that over this year, over 24 or 25, so she can earn back that working capital, which is unusual. Usually you lose the working capital. So it's a win-win for both sides, because on the seller side, she thinks, I'm going to hit these numbers, I'll get my money back. On the buyer side, yes, he's paying that money back, but the valuation of the company has increased significantly because of that. And on the math that I did on how I structured it, for every additional dollar in net, on $500,000, they were netting roughly 60,000 or so incrementally, and they were going to give back half of it to the seller. They'll keep half of it, so they're getting an incremental $30,000 per 500,000 in net for that year, and obviously that should continue year after year after year. Additionally, the valuation of the business for every $500,000 increased by roughly $300,000. So they're splitting the additional net that is far higher than when they bought the business, and they're 10xing the split in a valuation perspective as well. So it really becomes a win-win on both sides, and that's how I sold it to the buyer and the seller, so that the seller has a realistic opportunity to get their working capital back, and the buyer, if they get the working capital back, is thrilled to give it because the valuation is higher and they've made more bottom line money.
It's a win-win.
Yeah.
That's business. Win-win. Everyone wins or everyone loses.